to fossil fuel polluters, gas seems to have become the lifeline that vaping was for the tobacco lobby.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Rann, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. In Brazil, the 30th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP as it's well known, is drawing to a close. With the world on track to overshoot the Paris target of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees, Brazil's President Lula called for this to be a COP of truth.
In the age of misinformation, those who seek to obscure the truth reject not only scientific evidence, but also the progress of multilateralism. They control algorithms, sow hatred and spread fear. They attack institutions, science and universities. It is time to inflict a new defeat on the deniers.
At the time of recording, the Australian government still hopes to host COP31 in partnership with Pacific Island nations. But whoever wins hosting rights, it surely needs to be the COP of bravery. Bravery to not only centre the voices of those on the front lines of climate change impacts, but to dismiss the attempts of the fossil fuel lobby and its allies to delay and deny action. And of course, the bravery to phase out fossil fuels. Mike Rann was South Australian Premier from 2002 to 2011. When Mr Rann became Premier, South Australia had zero renewables. But his government pioneered bold reforms and now more than 60% of the state's energy comes from wind and solar. In Adelaide last week, he delivered the second Hugh Sadler Memorial Lecture. This event is dedicated to the late Dr. Hugh Sadler, an energy transition expert and founding director of the Australia Institute, whose expertise helped lay the groundwork for Australia's renewable energy transition. In this year's lecture, Mike, who is now the chair of the UK Climate Group, spoke about the politics of climate ambition, the importance of courage, and lessons from South Australia's renewable energy transformation. We start with him discussing South Australia's national leadership on progressive reform. He describes the Dunstan government's advancement of civil liberties in the 1960s and 70s, and how, with Dunstan spending nearly a decade as Premier, it showed that brave policy can also be great politics.
Now, shortly after Don died in 1999, an academic paying tribute said Don Dunstan was a statesman, not a poll-driven, partisan politician obsessed with staying in office. She clearly didn't know him because Don was very partisan, and he loathed the cold citadels of privilege and prejudice that had held back equality of opportunity in Australia for so long. Don was also perhaps the first political leader in Australia to use opinion polls, certainly one of the first. He told me that it was important to win at least 3 elections in a row in order to embed lasting reform rather than seeing them quickly overturned by subsequent Conservative governments. Don used polling to help him sell his reform agenda, not to tell him what to do. Faced with an often hostile print media, he mastered television to punch through his message. His example tells us that leaders have to lead, but in doing so have to stay in touch with those they are leading. And very importantly, he showed us that policy bravery can be politically popular. His government kept winning election after election. So what about today? Anthony Albanese deserves great credit for honouring his commitment to hold a constitutional referendum for an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
The Referendum Working Group and the government have agreed on the provisions that all Australians will vote on in this year's referendum. I want to thank sincerely all the members of the working group and all who have engaged with them. This moment has been a very long time in the making. Yet they have shown such patience and optimism through this process. And that spirit of cooperation and thoughtful, respectful dialogue has been so important at arriving at this point in such a united fashion.
His campaign wasn't successful, and to be honest, the referendum's defeat became likely when the opposition decided to oppose it. But Albanese didn't throw in the towel. The Prime Minister kept going, even though he knew he would lose more than paint politically if the referendum failed. He kept his promise to First Nations people, and in doing so faced a well-financed, lurid and at times racist No campaign, which brought out the worst in Australia. Our much touted tradition of mateship took a battering, and the Prime Minister's authority was for a while diminished. Ironically, the Prime Minister also deserves credit for his bravery in breaking a pre-election pledge to honour the Morrison government's Stage 3 tax cuts. He reviewed and ultimately reneged on that promise, a most painful process politically, because it was clearly in the interest of the majority of Australians to do so. So Anthony Albanese copped it for breaking his word on tax cuts for the wealthy, just as he copped it for keeping his word on the voice. And the Prime Minister was pretty much written off by many political commentators at the end of 2024, but went on to win a smashing record victory for Labor in the history of Australia. The majority of Australians could see who a coalition government would benefit, and it wasn't them. So they took the phone off the hook on Peter Dutton, and it's still off the hook with his successors. With brewing leadership tensions and a forward-to-the-past debate over climate policy, it's quite clear that the coalition still hasn't worked out why they lost so badly at the last federal election. So in a second term with a big majority, where and when should political bravery resurface? In late 2026, the 31st United Nations Climate Conference of the Parties will hopefully be held in Australia, and if it does, Adelaide will be the host city of what will be known as the Pacific COP. Now, COPs are prestigious, and the tens of thousands of visitors who descend on a host city for several weeks provide a welcome economic boost. For Adelaide, hosting a COP will eclipse the economic impact and international profile of any event in this city's history. But we've got to remember that COPs are messy, with their climate outcomes mostly disappointing, with only incremental progress registered each year in the final text that has to be agreed by close to 200 nations. Now, every COP attracts a swarm of many hundreds of fossil fuel lobbyists corralling delegates. Politicians might say that they can't be bought, but over the years some have clearly been rented when donations were big enough. Last year, 1,773 registered fossil fuel lobbyists attended COP29 in Baku. This lobby has learned from the tobacco industry's tactics. It knows that denying man-made climate change is no longer credible. Their mission then is simply to delay climate action to allow fossil fuel industries to continue to make profits from the damage they do. We saw this formula played out in the last federal election. The coalition's Nuclear Power Stations for All pledge was a hoax. It was really about stalling the rollout of renewables to allow coal and gas-fueled power stations to continue as long as possible in the lead-up to the 2050 net zero deadline. The problem for the opposition's election strategy was that the real-life experience of Australians with climate change, in terms of record temperatures, massive and repeated floods, the fiercest bushfires, and a looming insurance crisis, is now matching the persistent warnings of the scientists over the years. For Australia, the adverse consequences of climate change are no longer a distant glimpse of the future because it's happening right now. At a series of COPs, the fossil fuel lobby have fought hard to prevent the internationally agreed text issued at the end of each conference from laying the blame for climate change on fossil fuels, or even worse, prescribing a timetable for their phasing out. It's not just countries like Saudi Arabia leading the charge to frustrate climate action. Amongst the battalions of lobbyists are those representing companies wholly owned by governments who publicly tell a different story. They will be coming to COP31 desperate to avoid any commitments to phase out the cause of the problem that threatens billions of people on our planet.
Countries that cling to fossil fuels are not protecting their economies, they are sabotaging them, driving up costs, undermining competitiveness, locking in stranded assets.
The Australian government rejects it, and not only rejects it, counters with, no, we need more gas. So again, we're not transitioning away from it. We're ignoring the climate science here. It's a democracy. We're allowed to do this, but we should own the consequences.
The gas cartel often tell us that there's a shortage of gas in Australia. That is simply a lie, and it's the basis that they use to make profit.
Australia doesn't have a gas supply shortage. We have a gas export problem.
For the Australian fossil fuel industry, maintaining an ongoing bipartisan commitment to gas exploration, production, and almost tax-free exports is their central objective. They've been doing very well so far, and for fossil fuel polluters, gas seems to have become the lifeline that vaping was for the tobacco lobby. Now, in addition to the lobbyists, there will be a large number of climate NGOs and protesters who've been frustrated by recent COPs being held in less democratic oil and gas-rich nations, where demonstrators would not be well received, let alone well treated. So at COP31, Australia's climate credentials will be under the closest scrutiny. Under coalition governments, Australia was seen as on a par with the worst on climate action, along with first-term Trump's America, Bolsonaro's Brazil, and Middle Eastern oil states. So I'm not surprised at all today, and there'll be more tomorrow, that in opposition, they now want to turn their backs on science and raise the white flag on Australia's future. The opposition's fossil fuel donors call the shots, and Susan Lay's leadership is on the slippery slope to oblivion. The Albanese government is seen as better, more mainstream than its predecessors, with Australia's recently announced nationally determined commitments, our carbon reduction targets, being judged internationally as better than expected. Australia also gets considerable credit for its commitment to 30 by 30, an international campaign spearheaded by the Campaign for Nature, for nations to announce high levels of environmental protection for 30% of their lands and waters by 2030. So Australia's move to protect vast areas of our sub-Antarctic islands and oceans has been acclaimed internationally. Now, I want to acknowledge Chris Bowen's energetic leadership as Federal Minister for Climate Change and Energy. He had a hell of a lot of ground to make up. And I was just recently in New York at Climate Week, and I saw firsthand how hard he's working to secure COP31 for Adelaide. So is the state government, so is Jane Lomax-Smith, who's now in Brazil advocating for this city. I particularly commend his $2.3 billion Cheaper Home Batteries program, which provides an upfront discount of around 30% on eligible home battery systems. The program aims to install 1 million home batteries by 2030, and as of Friday last week, 113,267 home batteries have been installed since July 1 this year. About 1,000 systems are being installed every day. This is a game changer for the grid, and not only because of the welcome reductions to home energy bills, The program allows households to harness the power of rooftop solar when it's abundant in the middle of the day, but when many people are not at home, to utilise it, and time shift that usage to the evening peak when homes would otherwise be reliant on power from fossil fuel generation. This reduces demand in the evening peak, lowering costs for everyone, and creates a more stable grid overall. However, Australia's continued approval of new and expanded coal mines and its massive embrace of a gas industry continuing well beyond 2050 means that Australia is often seen internationally as walking both sides of the street on climate, even though the current government is light years ahead of its predecessors on climate and energy. For an Australian COP to be a real success, I hope the Albanese government will announce that it will stop approving new or expanded coal mines. I hope it will detail its timetable to phase out coal-powered electricity. It's got to be frank with the Australian people about whether it sees gas as a transition fuel to a net zero future or as something more. The Albanese government, I hope, will also unveil a serious upgrade of Australia's environmental protection laws, not legislation that looks good but has got loopholes. I, like many others, hope that serious tax reform will also be embraced in this term of government. And like the Australia Institute, I'm appalled that multinational gas companies are making massive multi-billion-dollar profits from exporting Australian resources while paying little tax. Fixing this could be a big step in a second-term tax reform agenda. Our Pacific Island neighbours have often registered their unhappiness with Australia's addiction to fossil fuels, given the existential threat of climate change to low-lying nations. Despite their concerns, Pacific nations have strongly backed Australia's campaign to host COP31. I chaired a meeting of Pacific Island leaders in New York recently, which was attended by Chris Bowen and also by Kevin Rudd. A bigger commitment by Australia at the COP in Adelaide to assist Pacific nations with nature-based projects on land and sea will be important for them and for Australia's credibility. It would be seen as a real Pacific dividend from COP31 for our neighbours that goes beyond the text of the final communique. Bravery in climate leadership could well be a defining legacy for Anthony Albanese's Prime Ministership, just as Medicare was for Bob Hawke, compulsory superannuation for Paul Keating, and the apology to Indigenous Australians for Kevin Rudd.
You're listening to Mike Rann, former Premier of South Australia, delivering the second Hugh Sadler Memorial Lecture. Mike Rann says no other state comes close to South Australia's transformation, and it has a target of 100% net renewable energy by 2027. He describes his government's efforts in the 2000s, way ahead of the rest of the country, to reduce the state's ecological footprint and embrace a renewable energy future.
We started with public education, with a series of high-profile initiatives, solar powering prominent buildings, the Parliament, Adelaide Airport, the Art Gallery Museum, the new pavilion at the Wayville Showgrounds, and a large number of schools. And we did other things like insisting on plumbed rainwater tanks for new homes, insisting on higher environmental energy ratings for buildings leased by the government. And we also planted 3 million native trees in a series of urban forests to shade, cool and beautify Adelaide and its suburbs. But most of all, we were hungry for energy companies to choose South Australia for their renewable energy investments. We achieved this not by handing out hundreds of millions of dollars, but by making the regulatory environment much easier than in other states. This paid off, giving us a first user advantage. We caught the other states napping. For some considerable time, South Australia, with around 7% of Australia's population, secured well over 50% and at times 60% of Australia's wind power investment worth billions of dollars and giving a big boost to our regional communities. I want to particularly acknowledge, by the way, the role of our former Commissioner for Renewable Energy, Professor Tim O'Loughlin, with his leadership. Our government was the first in Australia to legislate for a feed-in tariff to drive the rapid take-up of household solar. Today, around 1 in 2 South Australian homes have installed solar panels. In 2007, we passed another Australia first, the Climate Change and Greenhouse Emissions Reduction Act. This was the first legislation in the world to set a 2050 target, along with its interim targets for the percentage of renewably powered electricity and for emissions reductions. I mean, at that time, any government could commit to a 2050 target knowing that they wouldn't be around, maybe not even alive, to face the music. Weak leaders could leave it to their successors to make the hard decisions. Tough interim targets set in law make governments accountable along the way. I am so pleased that successive premiers have ensured a continuation of South Australia's leadership. So where are we at? By 2027, 100% of South Australia's electricity will be generated by renewables. And by 2030, we will likely have reduced our emissions by more than 60% compared to 2005 levels. These achievements are world-leading. It hasn't been a smooth ride with scare campaigns designed to derail progress. But the good news is that South Australians liked what was happening. They enjoyed and enjoy their state being a leader again, just as they did under Don Dunstan's leadership. Policy bravery was again popular. Labor was in office for a record 16 years, and after 4 years out has come back with renewed vigour on climate, energy and other fronts. And that's why I'm particularly excited about the prospect of COP being held here. We will obviously put on a great show for visitors, but more importantly, we'll be able to showcase from our own experience how the energy transition can work. So one of my key messages today is that there's a real difference between whipped up noise and genuine public opinion. I'll give you an example. When I announced that we would be the first state, one of the first jurisdictions in the world to ban the use of non-renewable plastic bags, retailers and commentators said it would damage business and cost jobs. I was told that it would be unpopular with shoppers. It wasn't. Polls showed it had the support of 80% of South Australians. Retailers who complained about the legislation were soon boasting about their green credentials. At the time, all the other states rejected embracing the same plastic bag ban. They're now on board, but let's remember it took 49 years for the rest of Australia to follow Don Dunstan's container deposit legislation because of scare campaigns that said it would damage the booze and soft drink industry. So unfortunately, it's too easy for governments to be spooked by loud or well-funded lobby groups, even though they do not come close to representing majority opinion.
Mike Rann is now chair of the UK Climate Group, whose membership includes subnational governments and more than 400 major corporations. He's often asked whether he's optimistic about the world reaching net zero by 2050, even more so since the election of the second Trump administration in the United States. Businesses and subnational governments all over the world, he says, are getting on with the job of decarbonisation regardless.
The quiet message from business is that they remain committed to achieving net zero because it makes business sense for them to do so. It's estimated that around 70% of the decisions made that affect renewable energy are made at the subnational level. On every continent, states and regions are acting as a goad to action to their national governments, just as we did. So getting back to the question I'm always asked, am I optimistic or pessimistic about reaching net zero on time? It's true that last week the World Meteorological Organization confirmed that greenhouse gas emissions have risen to a record high, sort of slowing down, but still a record high. 2025 is also on track to be the second or third warmest year ever recorded, with all of the 10 hottest years in measured history occurring during the past decade. It's true that the UN Secretary General warned last week that the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement to limit heating to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels has failed.
Science now tells us that the temporary overshoot between the 1.5 limit, starting at the latest in the early 2030s, is inevitable. Even a temporary average overshoot will have dramatic consequences. It could push ecosystems past irreversible tipping points, expose billions to unlivable conditions, and amplify threats to peace and security. Every fraction of a degree means more hunger, displacement, and loss, especially for those least responsible. This is moral failure and deadly negligence.
It's also true that the adverse impacts of climate change, including catastrophic weather events, are arriving more quickly and more damagingly than originally predicted. So my answer to the question I'm most often asked is that I'm cautiously optimistic. Why? Because there's recently been a positive tipping point. Massive levels of investment are now flowing more strongly into decarbonisation. Globally, around twice as much investment is now flowing into renewables and other clean energy technologies compared to fossil fuels. In 2025, total clean energy investment is expected to be around $2.2 trillion compared with total investment in coal, oil and natural gas expected to be around $1.1 trillion. In 2004, when South Australia first began to embrace a renewable future, it took 1 year for the world to add a single gigawatt of solar power. Today it's doing that every single day, every day. Now I agree with Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, that climate action is the economic growth story of the 21st century. Recently he pointed out what every investor knows, that it is much smarter to invest in the technologies of the 21st century rather than those of the 19th and 20th century. Innovation drives growth. And I haven't yet met a successful business leader who boasted to me about grasping a last mover advantage. Lord Stern headed the UK's landmark review of the economics of climate change. He concluded that climate change was the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. In a recent interview, however, he said that the economic opportunities climate action presented had also intensified due to the extraordinary pace of technological development. The cost of solar power and batteries have fallen 80% in the last decade, with offshore wind costs down 73% and onshore wind down 57%. And he said in this interview, plummeting costs of clean technologies from renewable energy to electric cars, plus the healthier and more productive societies they enable, meant that investments could simultaneously tackle the climate crisis and faltering economic growth and bring millions of people out of poverty. Now, recent figures from the International Energy Agency have also encouraged my optimism. Global renewable energy power capacity is expected to double between now and 2030, 5 years, increasing by a massive 4,600 gigawatts. China is the pace setter, and earlier this week the New York Times reported that China installed more wind and solar panels last year than the rest of the world combined. It is now likely to achieve its ambitious 2035 wind and solar targets 5 years ahead of schedule. It is now making more money exporting green technology than the US makes from exporting fossil fuels. India, another big emitter, is also on track to become the second largest growth market for renewables, with capacity set to rise by 2.5 times in 5 years. So what does this mean in terms of meeting global targets, particularly given the setback of the US again withdrawing from the Paris Agreement? In 2023, at the COP in Dubai, the nations of the world together pledged to triple the global use of renewable energy by 2030 in order to remain on schedule to reach net zero by 2050. At our current rate of growth, we would fall short with an increase of 2.6 times. However, even some energy hardheads believe that a 2.8 time increase is still possible by the 2030 deadline. Not quite enough to reach the target, but not far off the threefold increase required. And one of the big stars, of course, is the EU. At Climate Week in New York, I welcomed one of our keynote speakers, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who there pledged that the EU would stay the course on the multi-trillion euro European Green Deal she initiated in 2020, with its central commitment to make Europe the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. That's political courage. We have to ensure that our continent, Australia, matches them, and we can all be proud that South Australia has led and continues to lead the charge and is now being recognised for that leadership at conferences all around the world. Closing, I'd like to thank the Australia Institute for inaugurating these lectures, honouring Hugh Sadler's intellectual leadership of the climate debate in Australia. I would also like to commend the Institute for its provocative thought leadership around some of the big policy questions facing Australia. For years, when coalition governments were in power nationally, the Australia Institute held Prime Ministers, ministers and bureaucrats to account. It is doing the same today with Labor governments, and that's healthy for democracy. Given the deteriorating media landscape in Australia and a social media environment where facts, science, or civil discourse are too often jettisoned in favour of noise, prejudice, abuse and extremism, we need organisations like the Australia Institute to keep us focused on the real issues facing our nation's future. Thank you for having me here tonight.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's special episode. This year's Hugh Sadler Memorial Lecture was recorded on Thursday the 13th of November. If you want to read more about policy courage, our latest book from Australia Institute Press is available for pre-order right now. A Time for Bravery, What Happens When Australians Are Courageous, features essays from Yanis Varoufakis, the Honourable Ralph Regenvanu, Mike Rann, Senator Fatima Payman, Dr. Sophie Scomps, John Hewson, Craig Foster, and more. The essays examine what bravery looks like in Australia and how it can reshape our future for the better. Available for just $35.99, it's a perfect Christmas gift. You can pre-order it now at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.